Dorothy Sinclair spent 31 years telling other people's children exactly what not to hand over to family members who asked for financial help. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in April, reorganizing a drawer full of her own personal documents, she discovered she had ignored almost every piece of advice she'd ever given. This is her story. Dorothy was 73 years old, a retired bookkeeper who had spent 3 decades managing the finances of small businesses throughout her little corner of North Carolina: the hardware store, 2 family restaurants, a veterinary clinic, a landscaping company. She had built her entire professional reputation on a simple, unglamorous skill: noticing exactly where money and trust could quietly go wrong long before her clients noticed it themselves. She had warned dozens of small business owners over the years about exactly the kind of arrangements that seem harmless between family members and slowly become financially catastrophic. She thought of herself, reasonably, as someone who understood these dangers better than almost anyone she knew, which made it all the more unsettling that Sunday afternoon to sit on the floor of her home office with a half-emptied file drawer in front of her, realizing just how many of her own rules she had quietly broken in her own life, one reasonable-sounding exception at a time. Dorothy had been widowed 4 years earlier. Her husband, Walter, had managed the household finances alongside her for most of their marriage, and after he passed, she found herself, for the first time in years, entirely and solely responsible for her own financial life, the very thing she'd spent her career helping other people manage responsibly. She had one son, Kevin, 46, married to a warm, efficient woman named Amanda, 44. Dorothy loved them both fiercely, and it was precisely that love she was beginning to understand that had made her so willing to bend her own professional instincts when it came to her own family. She thought, sitting there on the floor that Sunday, about how differently she had once handled these exact questions for a client, a widow herself, in fact, one of Dorothy's longtime bookkeeping clients from years earlier, who had come to her worried about her own son's growing requests for financial help. Dorothy remembered advising that woman firmly, confidently, laying out a clear structure of boundaries and documentation that the woman had followed successfully for years afterward. It had seemed at the time like straightforward professional common sense. It had never once occurred to Dorothy that she might someday need that exact same advice for herself and fail quietly to take it. The first thing Dorothy had almost given away was access to her bank account itself. It started 18 months earlier on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Kevin called sounding more rattled than she'd heard him in years. His truck had broken down unexpectedly, a repair he genuinely couldn't afford that week, right in the middle of a stretch where his construction work had slowed considerably. He needed access to cash quickly, just for a few days, just until his next paycheck cleared. "Mom, could I just borrow your debit card for a couple days? I'll pay you back the second I get paid Friday. I just need to cover this repair, and I don't want it sitting on my credit card racking up interest." Dorothy hesitated, every professional instinct in her quietly objecting, and then set that instinct aside, telling herself this was different. This was Kevin. This was an emergency, not a pattern. She gave him her card and her PIN over the phone that evening. He paid her back that Friday, exactly as promised, and Dorothy felt a small private relief that her instincts had been overly cautious after all. But 3 months later, a similar situation arose, a plumbing emergency this time, and Kevin asked again, this time slightly more casually, as though the precedent had already been comfortably established. "You still have my card number saved from last time, right? Same as before?" Dorothy said yes, again, and this time, she noticed, he didn't even ask to borrow the physical card. He simply used the number she'd given him the first time, still saved somewhere in his own records, treating her account less like her private property and more like a standing line of credit available whenever a genuine need arose. It was her longtime friend Frances, 71, also retired, who first raised the alarm over lunch one Saturday. "Dorothy, you counsel small business owners for a living about exactly this kind of thing. You've told me stories for 30 years about family members who just needed to borrow something small and how it never stays small. Why are you letting Kevin do this?" Dorothy started to explain that it was different with her own son, and then stopped herself mid-sentence, hearing, with real discomfort, exactly how many of her own former clients had said precisely the same thing to her right before things went badly. She remembered specifically a landscaping business owner who had said almost those exact words about his own brother. 2 years before, that brother quietly emptied nearly $11,000 from the company account, one small borrowed sum at a time, each one individually forgivable. None of them ever quite worth the confrontation of saying no. The second thing Dorothy had almost given away was unrestricted access to her own home. She had given Amanda a spare key not long after Walter's death for legitimate emergency purposes, the reasonable, sensible precaution of an aging widow living alone in case she ever fell ill or simply couldn't get to the door herself. That part, Dorothy still believed, had been the right call. But somewhere over the following 2 years, the key had quietly stopped being reserved for emergencies at all. Amanda began letting herself in on ordinary afternoons, always with good intentions, always framed as helpfulness, dropping off a casserole, watering plants while Dorothy was out running errands, just checking in while Dorothy happened to be napping in the next room. Dorothy remembered vividly the afternoon she woke from an unplanned nap on her living room couch to find Amanda already standing in her kitchen, quietly reorganizing the pantry shelves. "Oh, you're up," Amanda said cheerfully, not seeming to register anything unusual about the scene. "I let myself in, didn't want to wake you. I noticed your canned goods were getting a little disorganized, so I thought I'd tidy up while I waited." Dorothy sat up on the couch, momentarily disoriented, trying to locate the exact feeling moving through her, not quite anger, not quite fear, something closer to the specific discomfort of realizing that her own home no longer felt entirely, reliably private. "Amanda," she said carefully, "I do appreciate you checking on me, but I'd really rather you call first or text before letting yourself in when I'm not expecting you." Amanda looked genuinely surprised by the request, as though the idea of calling first had never crossed her mind as a real necessity between family. "Of course, Dorothy, I didn't mean anything by it. I just worry about you being here alone." The apology was sincere, and nothing changed for very long. Within a few weeks, Amanda was letting herself in again, unannounced, always with a warm, reasonable-sounding explanation ready. The third thing Dorothy had almost given away was control over her own legal authority. This one arrived wrapped in the most convincing packaging of all: genuine, practical concern about the future. Kevin raised it during a Sunday dinner almost a year after the first debit card incident. "Mom, I've been thinking. We should probably get you set up with a power of attorney, just in case anything ever happens where you can't make decisions yourself. My buddy Ray does estate law now. He could put something together for you pretty quick, and honestly, probably give you a friends and family rate on it, too." Dorothy, of all people, understood exactly why a power of attorney mattered, and exactly why having one properly in place was simply responsible planning. What gave her pause, sitting at that dinner table, was something she almost let slide past unnoticed: the casual suggestion that the document be drafted by an attorney chosen and trusted by Kevin rather than by her. "That's a good idea," she told him carefully, "but I think I'd like to use my own attorney for something this important. No offense to Ray." "It would probably be cheaper with Ray, Mom, and it's not like it really matters who drafts it. The document says what it says." "Kevin, the document says whatever the attorney drafting it decides to include, within certain limits. I'd feel more comfortable with someone representing my interests specifically, not someone who's also your friend." Kevin seemed mildly put out by the pushback, though he didn't argue further. Dorothy noticed with some discomfort how close she had come to simply agreeing, out of a desire to avoid an awkward conversation, to letting someone she had never met, chosen by her son rather than by her, draft a document granting broad legal authority over her own affairs. Ray's draft arrived by email a few days later anyway, sent along by Kevin just so you can take a look, no pressure. Dorothy skimmed it that evening, tired after a long day, and set it aside in a folder without reading it as carefully as she would have once insisted a client read any document granting someone else legal authority over their affairs. She told herself she would look at it properly later, compare it against what her own attorney might eventually suggest. Later kept quietly not arriving, the folder simply accumulating dust in a drawer for months, unread but not entirely forgotten either, a loose thread she would eventually have to pull. The fourth thing Dorothy had almost given away was her digital privacy entirely. It began innocently enough, the way most of these things do. Dorothy had trouble one afternoon logging into her email account after a routine password update, locked out and frustrated, unable to remember which combination of letters and numbers she'd most recently chosen. She called Kevin, who walked her through it patiently over the phone, eventually just asking for her current password directly so he could troubleshoot the issue himself more efficiently than talking her through each step. He fixed the problem within 10 minutes, but in the process he had also, without either of them quite registering it as significant, gained full standing access to her email account, an access that was never formally revoked afterward. because revoking it would have required a conversation neither of them thought to have. Dorothy didn't think much more about it until several months later, when she mentioned during a casual phone call that she was considering switching her homeowner's insurance provider to save some money. "Oh, I actually already looked into that for you," Kevin said. "I saw the renewal notice come through and did some comparison shopping. I think we should stick with your current provider, honestly. The new one has worse reviews." Dorothy paused, genuinely confused. "How did you see my renewal notice, Kevin?" There was a brief, telling silence on the line. "It's still in your email, Mom, from when I fixed your password that one time. I never got around to changing it back." Dorothy sat with that revelation for a long moment after hanging up the phone, doing the uncomfortable math of exactly how many months her son had possessed quiet, ongoing access to her private correspondence, insurance renewals, bank notifications, medical portal messages, all of it sitting readable in an inbox she had assumed was entirely her own. The fifth thing Dorothy had almost given away was authority over her own mail and important documents. This one happened most recently, only 3 months before that Sunday afternoon in her office. Dorothy had taken a 2-week trip to visit an old college friend in Florida, and Amanda had offered, warmly and helpfully, to collect and organize Dorothy's mail while she was away, sorting the obvious junk from anything that looked important. It seemed at the time like a genuinely thoughtful gesture. Dorothy accepted gratefully, relieved not to return home to 2 weeks of accumulated clutter. But when she arrived home, she discovered that Amanda's definition of organizing had extended considerably further than simple sorting. A new homeowner's insurance policy renewal, the very one Kevin had already quietly reviewed months earlier through her email, had been opened, read, and apparently discussed between Kevin and Amanda, who had jointly decided, in Dorothy's absence, to switch providers to a plan Amanda felt was more cost-effective without Dorothy's knowledge or approval. "We just wanted to save you the hassle while you were traveling," Amanda explained when Dorothy asked with genuine confusion rather than anger why an insurance decision had apparently already been made in her name. "It seemed like something you'd want handled, not sitting around waiting for you." Dorothy thanked her evenly and said nothing further in the moment, but driving home from that conversation, something in her had finally fully clicked into focus. Not fury exactly, but a clear professional recognition of a pattern she would have flagged immediately in any client's life except her own. She thought, driving those quiet back roads home, about how naturally each individual step had unfolded. Nobody had ever sat her down and asked directly for sweeping control over her finances, her home, her legal affairs, her digital life, and her mail all at once. If anyone had asked for all of it together in a single conversation, she would have refused immediately, without a second thought, the same way she would have advised any client to refuse. Instead, it had arrived in 5 small, separate, individually reasonable pieces, spread out across 18 months, each one easy to justify entirely on its own. That, she realized, was precisely the danger she'd spent her whole career warning other families about. Not any single bad actor, but the slow, cumulative erosion of boundaries that never announced itself as a pattern until it was examined all at once. That Sunday afternoon in April, sitting on the floor of her home office in front of the half-emptied file drawer, Dorothy laid the pieces out in front of her, physically, one at a time, the way she used to lay out evidence for a client who needed to see a problem clearly rather than simply be told about it. A bank statement showing a debit card charge she hadn't immediately recognized until she remembered with some effort that it had come from Kevin's card use months earlier. A copy of the power of attorney draft Ray had sent over, which she had never fully read line by line, having assumed on some level that it would eventually get replaced by something from her own attorney, and therefore didn't require her full scrutiny. The new insurance policy, opened and altered without her direct authorization, sitting in a folder Amanda had helpfully labeled and organized. Dorothy sat with all of it spread out on the floor around her, and felt for the first time in 18 months the full weight of the pattern she had been living inside without ever quite naming it. She thought about every client she had ever counseled through similar situations over the decades. The restaurant owner whose brother had quietly drained the business account one small, reasonable-sounding withdrawal at a time. The veterinary clinic owner whose adult daughter had gained signing authority just to help out and slowly begun making unilateral decisions about vendor contracts. She had built her entire career helping people see exactly this pattern clearly in other people's lives, and somehow in her own life, wrapped in love rather than employment, she had let every single professional instinct go quiet. She called Frances that evening, and the two women talked for over an hour, Dorothy walking through everything she'd found in that drawer, out loud, in full, for the first time. "You've been giving your own family a pass you'd never give a client," Frances said gently, near the end of the call. "It's not too late to fix that, Dorothy. You know exactly how to fix this. You've just never applied it to yourself." The following Monday, Dorothy called Mr. Patterson, the attorney who had handled her and Walter's estate planning for over 20 years, a man with no personal connection to Kevin whatsoever, someone whose only professional obligation was to Dorothy's own interests. She sat across from his desk and described, item by item, exactly what she had allowed to accumulate over the past year and a half. Mr. Patterson listened carefully, without judgment, and then helped her build methodically a plan to properly restructure every single one of it. They canceled the power of attorney draft from Ray entirely, and Mr. Patterson drafted a new one himself, narrow, specific, and limited to genuine incapacity, with clear conditions defined precisely rather than left open to broad interpretation. Dorothy changed the password on every one of her online accounts that same week, and this time, rather than simply locking Kevin out entirely, she and Mr. Patterson's office set up a documented revocable emergency access system, a sealed record of her passwords, held securely by the attorney's office, accessible to Kevin only under specific predefined emergency circumstances, rather than sitting permanently and invisibly in his own memory. She had a direct conversation with Amanda about the spare key, establishing clear, simple rules. Texted advance notice for any non-emergency visit, full understanding that the key existed for genuine emergencies alone. And she canceled the automatic debit card arrangement with Kevin entirely, telling him plainly that future financial help, if she chose to offer it, would happen through a clear conversation and a specific decision each time, never through standing open-ended access to her account. The conversation with Kevin and Amanda together the following weekend was not an easy one, though Dorothy approached it with far more clarity than anger. "I need you both to understand something," she told them, sitting at her own kitchen table, the same table where so many of these small, reasonable-sounding requests had first been made. "None of this is about not trusting you. It's about the fact that I spent 31 years teaching other families exactly how these small, well-meaning arrangements go wrong, and I let every one of my own rules slide because it was you asking, not a stranger." Kevin looked genuinely stricken, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I never meant to take advantage of anything, Mom. It never felt like that, asking." "I believe you," Dorothy said. "That's actually the whole danger of it. It never feels like anything until you look at it all laid out together, the way I finally did." Amanda, for her part, apologized sincerely for the insurance decision, admitting with some visible discomfort that she had genuinely believed she was simply being helpful without fully considering that helpfulness and authority were two very different things when it came to someone else's private affairs. The new arrangement, once established, held steadily in the months that followed. Kevin still called his mother when he needed help, but now the conversations were direct, specific, and finite. A particular amount, for a particular reason, agreed to consciously each time, rather than drawn silently from a standing well of access. Amanda texted before every visit without exception, and the spare key returned quietly and completely to its original narrow purpose. Dorothy noticed something else shift too. In the months that followed, something she hadn't fully anticipated. The relationship itself, rather than growing more distant or strained under the new boundaries, actually grew warmer. Kevin began calling simply to talk, not attached to any request at all. Conversations that felt, for the first time in years, entirely free of the quiet financial undertow that had colored so many of their exchanges before. Amanda started asking Dorothy's opinion on things directly, rather than quietly deciding on her behalf and explaining afterward. Dorothy came to understand something she hadn't expected going into that difficult kitchen table conversation. That clear boundaries, properly explained and consistently held, hadn't damaged her family's closeness at all. If anything, they had removed a low, constant hum of resentment neither she nor Kevin had ever quite named out loud, replacing it with something steadier and more honest. Sitting in her office again, several weeks later, Dorothy finished reorganizing that same file, drawer, properly this time, with everything exactly where it belonged, every document reviewed, every arrangement documented and understood. She closed the drawer slowly, a small, private moment of satisfaction settling over her, the particular relief of a problem finally, thoroughly solved rather than simply managed around. Dorothy's story is worth telling precisely because she was, by any reasonable measure, the least likely person to fall into this pattern. A professional who had spent her entire career warning others about exactly this danger. If it could happen to her, quietly, one loving, reasonable-sounding request at a time. It can happen to any of us, regardless of how much experience or expertise we believe protects us. Here are the 5 things plainly that Dorothy learned never to hand over after 70, and that you shouldn't either. Never share your PIN or give direct access to your bank accounts, even once, even for a genuine emergency. A clearly defined, individually agreed loan protects everyone far better than standing access ever will, and it prevents a single reasonable exception from quietly becoming a permanent habit. Never hand over a spare key to your homes without clear, explicit rules about when and how it can be used. A key meant only for emergencies needs to actually stay that way in practice, not simply in the original intention behind giving it. Never sign a power of attorney or any similar legal document prepared by an attorney chosen by the person who will benefit from it. Always use your own independent attorney, someone whose only obligation is protecting your interests specifically. Never leave a family member with permanent ongoing access to your passwords or online accounts, even after they've helped you solve a one-time problem. Set up a documented, revocable emergency system instead, one that can be reviewed and controlled, rather than an invisible standing door left open indefinitely. And never let someone else take over your mail or your important documents without your direct oversight. Help with logistics is one thing. Authority over decisions made in your name is something else entirely, and the two should never quietly blur together. Trusting your children is not the problem. Failing to build clear, documented structure around that trust is where the real danger quietly lives, not in any single request, but in the slow accumulation of small, loving exceptions that, laid out together, tell a very different story than any one of them told alone. Which of these 5 things would you never hand over to your children? Tell us in the comments below, and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else in the middle of what feels like a small, harmless favor right now might need to read your answer before that favor quietly becomes something much larger. If Dorothy's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity Years, because loving your family and protecting yourself from them by accident were never meant to be in conflict.